right, so we're going to start today with a little bit of an example in our psychological health talk. So imagine this is being recorded in early May. So imagine mid-spring, about 400 years earlier, in Wisconsin. You're kind of traveling along with your tribe. And it's one of those days where it's kind of overcast and spitting a little bit of rain, and it's cold and kind of miserable, and you're moving through an area, and as you go by, you see that there's a couple of nice caves that you could duck into. You could get out of the rain, get out of the wind, have an opportunity to dry off, and it looks enticing. But it's mid-April, mid-spring. What you don't know is what's in the cave. And it could be that you duck into a cave, you dry off a little bit, but at the same time, there's a bear hibernating in the cave that's just waking up and is very hungry. Now, this scenario is not one that is all that far-fetched. Some of our ancestors actually had to make these kinds of decisions. And in those early tribes, there were individuals that would say, I don't think I should go into that cave because there could be a bear in there, and that bear could be waking up and it could decide that I would look pretty tasty for lunch. And others in that tribe might have said, I don't care, I'm going to go into that cave, I'm going to take my chance, I'm going to get dry, get warm, and then keep going. Well, it turns out that those individuals who are willing to suffer through the uncomfortability of avoiding the cave because there might be danger were much less likely to be eaten than those who said, well, I'm going to take a chance. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who took a chance and went into the cave would have been eaten, but some would have been. And so over time, those people who didn't go into the cave had more children. One of the things that means, of course, is that we are the descendants of cowards. It also means that those individuals who were more willing to be negative, more willing to worry and wonder what happens if I take this chance, and who were more cautious tended to survive and therefore had more descendants. And over time, those individuals who were more cautious did tend to survive more and have more children. And so we have actually a negativity bias. Human beings are set up to notice potential dangers, potential difficulties, potential negativity. We're more sensitive to that than we are to things that are more positive. It's estimated that we are at least twice as sensitive to the negative as we are to the positive. Now, this shows up in a variety of ways. So one of the places that it shows up is when you turn on the news or you go looking at a news source. News sources are notorious for showing us what's dangerous, what's potentially disturbing, what's negative. And there's even a saying in news media that if it bleeds, it leads. so that the tendency for us to be sensitive to negativity shows up in the kinds of news stories that we get. We're much more likely to open a news story on our electronic media, or stay with a story that shows danger, than we are to look at a story that is more positive. And in fact, positive news sources are often, while people say that they want them more, they're often not viewed as often. And that's because we have this bias. It also means that if I'm giving a presentation, just as an example, and there's 100 people in the room, and at the end of that presentation, let's say 15 people come up to have a little conversation. 14 of them come up to say, that was really helpful, we really liked what you had to say, this is going to help me in my life. And one person comes up and is critical of the presentation. Because I'm a human being, and because my ancestors had to make those decisions about whether to go into the cave, I'm going to remember that criticism more clearly than I will the 14 positive comments that I got at the end of that presentation. That doesn't seem like it would be appropriate, but that's the way it is. And so it's important to understand that, and it's important to recognize that. We have a tendency right now in the self-help literature to say, get rid of all negativity. Don't allow yourself to have negative thoughts. Only think positive thoughts. That's framed in a variety of different ways, but however it's framed, it can't work. Because as human beings, we have a sensitivity to the negative, that we overvalue over the things that are positive. That means that if I say I'm going to eliminate all the negativity in my life, it turns out that doesn't work for a very simple reason. My brain keeps going back to seeing, okay, is all the negativity really out? What about this? What about that? If I don't notice this, what then? See, for our early ancestors especially, being able to be tuned into the negative was often a survival skill. If I'm walking through the desert, we believe that our earliest ancestors probably lived in the northern climes of Africa. If I'm walking through the desert, come upon an oasis, and there's a beautiful pool of water, and a couple of palm trees giving shade, some gorgeous flowers, and a lion. It makes sense for human beings to survive to notice the lion first. We don't overlook things that potentially are threatening to us. Now, that turns out to be important because it tells us a little bit about how our brains work. Our brains do a lot of different things, and what we're looking at right now is a small sample. So brains keep our breathing regular. They help us to make sure that our organs are getting the kind of supplies that they need, the hormones, the blood supplies, all of those kinds of things. All of those things are happening in the background. Sensory experiences are being integrated. There's a lot that's going on in our brains that's beyond what we're going to talk about right now. But one of the functions of brains is that it tries to make a prediction on what's about to happen so that it can help us to make decisions. It does that by taking information that have happened historically for us in the past and looking at what's happening now, matching it to what's happened in the past to make a prediction about what's likely to happen next. Now it turns out that our brain learns by making errors in predictions and therefore having to update that information so that the next prediction will avoid the previous error and update the information to be potentially more accurate the next time we're in a similar situation. One of the things that means is our brains are tuned into the negative, the error, as a way to learn and to make our lives better, because when we are making more accurate predictions, we are going to be able to navigate our lives better. But we learn by making mistakes. In fact, that's what happens in school. If a teacher were to teach and every lesson that was presented was a lesson that all the students already knew, the students wouldn't learn very well. So the teacher has to present information that the students will make some errors on in order to be able to learn from their errors, to correct it, to be able to be better at solving those problems going forward. And that's a basic way that our brains work. Well, we've got some examples of this, and I'm not going to try to pretend, and nor do I want to even suggest, that negativity is always a good thing. But negativity does affect how our brains develop. So one of the research studies, this research study originally was done at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. They studied the brains of people who had long-term issues with depression, and they put them all through imaging so that they could see how brains looked for people who have long-term depressive effects. And one of the things that they found was that people with long-term depression actually have a portion of their brain that grows larger, and this is the area that we believe is associated with depressed mood. So their brain is actually unbalanced as a result of that. Well, I like to think of it as a kind of an analogy. So suppose I wanted to go to the gym, but I was not very wealthy, so I went to a very simple gym that didn't have a lot of resources. And in fact, in this gym that I picked, this is obviously a made-up story, but in this gym that I picked, I go in and there's only one dumbbell. Well, I want to get my body to have more muscle, so I pick up the dumbbell and I start doing some curls with that dumbbell with my right arm. Because there's only one dumbbell, one of the things that's happening is this arm is getting stronger. This arm is being neglected. Okay? So over time, I get some strength in this arm because I'm regular on my exercise and I'm constantly lifting with that dumbbell. This arm is being neglected. Well, what happens in my daily life if I have to pick something up? I'm going to pick something up with my right hand because that's my stronger arm. And I'm going to neglect my left hand. Well, that's what happens when a person gets depressed over a long period of time. Their brain begins to have a stronger connection to the things that are negative in their life. And they begin to see the world through that negative lens. The negative bias sets us up for that, so that something bad happens, we remember it, we use that as a prediction, that becomes the way we begin to view the world, and that negative bias starts to starts to make a change. Well, one of the things that we know then from follow-up research, this research was actually done at NYU, based on 8 weeks of mindfulness training. What happened, they started off by putting those individuals through a brain scan similar to the one with people that were depressed. We found out when people were depressed, they had a part of their brain that was larger that was responsible for being depressed. After 8 weeks of mindfulness meditation training, what had happened was that the other side of their brain had actually grown in size and was starting to become more functional. So it turns out that the brain is a little bit more like a muscle than we thought. And how we use the brain actually helps to determine the structure of the brain in much the same way as how we use our muscles begins to determine how our bodies look. So if I exercise regularly, my body looks different than it does if I don't exercise. If I try to develop my muscles, those muscles then become more functional and I use them more in my life, and that continues to grow over time because I'm using the things that I have available. That's why the negativity bias is an important thing to understand. If I can't get rid of it, I recognize that one of the things that happens is that I then will use that awareness of negativity as part of how I interact with my life. Now, that becomes important because there are times when that becomes of an important value. So one of the things that we've discovered is that if we look at couples who are in a satisfying relationship, so they looked at couples that were together more than 20 years, who still reported, because there are couples that are together for a long period of time who are unhappy in their relationships, but we looked at couples that were together for more than 20 years who were satisfied with their relationship. And one of the things that we found out with those couples in observing their communications is that they actually communicated positively towards each other on a ratio of approximately 3 to 1 positive interactions versus negative interactions. This is interesting in on a couple of levels. One of the things that was interesting about it is that 7 studies that were completely independent came up with the same number. This 3 to 1 ratio predicts couples being more satisfied in long-term relationships. So they were done in different labs across the world. They did not have connections with the labs that had done it before. They were doing completely independent research. What's also interesting about that is that when we look at the ideal ratio for a sailboat, the sailboat should have a sail that's 3 times the size of the keel. The sail, of course, is this top level here with the white. The keel is underneath the sailboat and is part of the steering mechanism. So what we discovered with sailboats is that if the sail is too small, you can't get the boat to move forward, and we need a certain size of the sail in order for the sailboat to be able to glide across the waters and make good use of the wind. But if the keel is too large, one of the things that happens is that it becomes very difficult to turn the sailboat. And that's an interesting way to think about it. Even if the sail and the keel are 2 to 1, or worse yet, 1 to 1, it's hard to turn the sailboat. it isn't that being positive is a bad thing. And in fact, the data is very clear. It's helpful to have a ratio in which we are paying more attention to the positive than we are to the negative. But if we don't pay any attention at all to the negative, it's hard to make the adjustments in life that we need to make in order to make the progress that we want. So couples that say we never argue aren't necessarily stable couples, because it's necessary sometimes in relationships to bring up problems so that the relationship can be adjusted. It can move in a different direction in order to be able to continue to make progress. But if the complaints are too overwhelming, what happens is that it's impossible to make any progress, because it becomes bogged down. Everything becomes negative. It becomes hard to make any changes at all. So the challenge for us is to keep a balance. The challenge for us is to find a way not to get overwhelmed by the negativity. And people who are overwhelmed by negativity often need professional help, and we'll be talking about that more in our next talk. But it is also inappropriate for us to become overwhelmed with positivity, because we need both. We need to be able to move forward. We need to be able to adjust and make adjustments in our lives so that we can adapt to the things that are potentially difficult or dangerous for us. So that means that in order to be able to be really effective in the work that we do in our own lives, in our relationships, in our professional lives, in our efforts to raise good and healthy and responsible children, we have to keep a balance. Now, here's the kicker. Because we have a negativity bias, when something bad happens, it intrudes on our daily life. It becomes something that it would be inappropriate for us to just ignore. If you're walking down the street and you see someone running at you and they look really angry and they're focused on you, you want to interrupt the normal daily stroll you're having and be able to focus on that person so that you can keep yourself safe. That negativity intrudes for us. We don't need to do anything to notice it. And again, that's one of the things that marketers, news media, other groups take advantage of. If they can get the right kind of headline, it intrudes. We then become drawn into paying attention to that. It is the case that when we are paying attention to the things that are pleasant in our lives, the positive things in our lives, the happy things in our lives, that can easily get pushed into the background. We don't necessarily have to pay attention in our initial look at, walking through the desert, coming upon a pool of water, the palm trees, the flowers. All of those things can fade into the background because there's a lion there. If the lion goes away, then we can choose to pay attention to the pleasant things in that scene. Now, one of the advantages of that, of course, is that in order to enjoy something, I have to choose to do that. I actually have to be present for it. I can walk past a beautiful sunset, and if I never look up, I will never be able to enjoy that beautiful sunset. I have to choose to do it. So becoming more willing to be positive requires paying attention, and that requires choosing to pay attention. I can do it. As you're listening to this talk right now, you could choose to notice something about your body that is pleasant. Even if you have things that are chronically disrupting for you, you've got some chronic pain, or you're in a situation in which you feel cramped or whatever, there's still more right with you than there is going wrong with you. And you could choose to notice, oh, but my elbow feels just fine, or whatever it might be. So I can choose to pay attention to what's positive. I can be interrupted when there's something negative. And so part of what happens in successful relationships, in creative situations, in places where we get a balance, is that we make choices to pay attention to what's good in our lives while not ignoring the negative, keeping it in proportion, keeping that ratio. The ratio, once again, is approximately 3-to-1, because 2-to-1, it feels like we're doing okay, but we're not really thriving. 1-to-1, we feel more negative than would be warranted because we overvalue the negative. It's in that 3-to-1 ratio that we can begin to start to say, okay, my life is going the way that I would want it to. My relationship is going the way that I would want it to. And in order to do that, there's a question that I like to ask myself, and that I would recommend that you ask yourself pretty much on a daily basis. The question is, what went well today? And why did it go well? Now, earlier in our series of talks, I did an introduction to mindfulness and an introduction to optimism. If you were to go back and rewatch that introduction to optimism, it'll flesh this out a little bit more. But part of the reason that I asked that question, what went well today, and why did it go well, is that, first of all, I'm choosing to pay attention to something that's pleasant, something that's positive, something that's moving me forward. But I'm also choosing then to notice what I did to contribute to that going well. And that makes it more prominent in the way that I'm paying attention to it, and starts to rebalance. I don't have to ask that kind of question with things that are going negatively, because those have already intruded. I've already noticed those during the day. But if I can take the time at the end of a day or at the beginning of the next day to ask myself to pay attention on purpose to things that might be going well, that helps me to keep that whole thing in balance. That's the real advantage of developing a gratitude in our lives. It isn't that we then ignore the negative, it's that we keep it in balance. The negative has got an important role to play in our lives. It isn't something we should just overlook, but we need to keep it in balance so that it doesn't become the only thing in our lives. Now, that becomes important as we look at the next two of our psychological health talks, because we're going to be talking about how to pick the right expert to help us, to guide us in developing a healthy life, and that negativity bias will sometimes cause us to be too cautious and not make the changes we need to make in order to move forward. And an expert can help us with that, but we have to pick the right kind of expert in order to do that. And then when we're looking at habits, we all know that habits can easily, we can develop bad habits, but equally we can develop good habits. And knowing that there's a negativity bias will help us to be able to identify what habits we need to change and what habits we need to foster in order to be able to move forward in our life in the most positive way. So hopefully you'll be able to gain from understanding the negativity bias and keeping it in balance for yourself and using it as a way to move forward in your journey to live a healthier life. I will look forward to talking with you soon again and connecting with you on this journey to our psychological health.